Looks like the interpretation is all set up to
Yes.
work smoothly, so that's great.
Good.
Morning, is Bercy?
Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Do you need to access the interpretation?
For me, it was good interpretation, but it's not possible. I understand sometimes, but for me, it is good interpretation.
You can, I'm gonna, in another minute, I will explain how to, but if you go down to at the bottom of the screen where it says interpretation, you just have to hit Spanish and you'll go into and you'll hear that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mhm.
So that's wonderful. We have a lot of people joining. It's very exciting. I love when we have a lot of people.
There. Nope. You want message stream? Okay. Mute yourself. Do you want to be unmuted? You're
Yes,
muted.
please mute yourself so that the presentation is not interrupted.
It's nice on you.
If you don't know how, I can mute you actually myself. Oh, there you go. Wonderful. Thank you, Janice. There will be a time at the end if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions later, but I'm going to actually, let me start. Okay. Let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just a few housekeeping. We do have language interpretation available today. If you can either select the globe icon at the bottom, click on that and hit Spanish or English, depending on what you would prefer. Or I believe you can hit to the right. If there's ellipses there, you may find it there. Hit language interpretation and then just tap the language that you would like to hear here. So welcome everyone. My name is Dawn Monaco. I am the project director for Real Transition Partners here at SPAN Parent Advocacy Network in New Jersey. But this is a jointly managed project between SPAN, the Federation for Children with Special Needs in Massachusetts, Include NYC, which is in Manhattan, the parent network of Western New York in Buffalo, and Starbridge in Rochester, New York. Real Transition Partners provides information, training, and technical assistance and support to parent center staff, youth and young adults with disabilities, and their families and professionals. So just a few items. We are recording this, so the recording will be available shortly after, within a day or two. It will be emailed to the email that you registered with. It'll come from Eventbrite, which is where you registered, and I will send it out through that, along with a copy of the PowerPoint. So we always get questions about that. Yes, you will receive a copy of the PowerPoint. There will be time at the end, but I do believe that NTACT probably has put in some time during the presentation where they'll stop and ask if there's any questions. We will also monitor the chat and they will respond to some of your questions in the chat as well. But if you need to wait till the end to unmute, that's fine. We will have some time for questions and answers at the end as well. And there will be a poll that I'll be posting at the end. We want to know your thoughts and see how this, if this has been helpful to you. So please react to that poll so that we can get your comments at the end. It's very important because that's how we develop new presentations for you. So I'm going to stop. And so today we have the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative, presenting. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. However, there's a way to access part 1 if you were not in attendance, but you didn't have to be in attendance for part 1 in order to be here today for part 2. And if you need a copy of that recording, we'll put a website up in the chat. You can go to the Real Transition Partners webpage on the SPAN Parent Advocacy Network website, and all the recordings for all the webinars that we do are on that page. You can access it that way. If for whatever reason you can't find it, I'll put my email in the chat, and you can certainly email me and I'll email it back to you. So I want to thank NTACT for presenting for us today. We've been working with them for many, many years on this project, and it's always wonderful when they are here. So I'm going to turn it over to them. We have several presenters, and they will go ahead and introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you everyone for being here. As Dawn said, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. Today we are going to be going over the continuum of vocational rehabilitation services. I am Allison Lowenthal, and I am out of the University of Maryland, and I am joined here today by Bridget Griffin, Christine Johnson, and Sandy Miller, who are all out of George Washington University. But as Dawn said, we are all out of the NTACT-The Collaborative, so we are excited to be here today. So thank you all for joining us. So the purpose of NTACT-C is really about building state agency collaboration to use data-driven decision-making processes that will help strengthen interagency partnerships. We also provide quality professional development to state agencies and institute technical assistance systems to support local education agencies, vocational rehabilitation, and other service providers in implementing effective pre-employment transition services and other secondary transition practices and predictors. We do all of that, however, for the benefit for students. And so we're really looking at how all students and youth with disabilities experience increased enrollment in post-secondary education, increased credential attainment, competitive integrated employment, and community engagement. We are funded through, the NTACT-C is funded through a grant, which is H326E200003 from the Department of Education. However, it is important to understand that the contents don't necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government based on what is in this presentation today. Today, our objectives that we will be covering is we're wanting to give you an increased understanding of the continuum of VR services, including pre-employment transition services, also known as Pre-ETS, and vocational rehabilitation transition services. We will also give you an increased understanding of vocational rehabilitation transition services and who can receive them, and an increased understanding of what an individual plan for employment, also known as an IPE, includes, and the role of student, youth, and parents can play in the development of the IPE. So with that, we would really like to know today who is all in the room. So if you can take a moment to type in the chat just who you are, what state you're from, who you represent. Are you a parent? Are you a student? Are you a person who works for an agency? We would love to know who's here. So if you could just take a moment and type in the chat who you are, I would really appreciate that.
Allison, just a note while we're waiting for that, the interpreter has asked if you just slow down just a bit.
Sure thing.
You.
I'd love to see we have youth engagement people, we have parents, higher education, people from working with developmental disabilities, more parents, and I love that we're getting multiple states all over. Consultant from Deaf Blind Project, that's wonderful. Pre-ETS program manager, parent training and information centers. This is wonderful. Oh, they're coming in fast now. I love that we have so many parents, though. That really was kind of where we were going today, is really making sure we get all of that. And so we're so excited to see so many of you here and from all over. Give you guys a couple more minutes. Youth services, wonderful. Higher education. Thank you guys so much. Now with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Christine, to give you some more information. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Allison. I'm going to just do a little overview of pre-employment transition services, and we're going to talk about the continuum of VR services. I had put the first part 1 webinar that we did in the chat, and I will put it again for anyone who's joined us later. But this is just a little brief overview to give you some context for today's webinar. So as you can maybe see on the screen, the continuum of VR services actually now starts with the inclusion of pre-employment transition services, or Pre-ETS. These are actually the earliest set of services that are available for potentially eligible or eligible students with disabilities. They're short-term in nature. They help to identify career interest. They are a specific set of 5 required activities, and these are actually provided directly to students with disabilities under Pre-ETS. In addition, the state VR agencies must reserve a minimum of 15% of their federal funds in order to provide these Pre-ETS services. So we're looking at now this with the inclusion of WIOA and the amendments to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, pre-employment transition services actually expand and go from the most basic services that we can offer to students with disabilities to the most individualized and intensive services for those who apply. So moving on this continuum, if a student so wishes or needs, they can apply and to be to the VR agency for transition services. So these would be available to eligible students or youth with disabilities through that Individualized Plan for Employment, the IPE, which we'll discuss a little further into this session. And this is where that individual can then further develop and pursue career interest and look at what they really want to do as a goal. And from that, we go and move on to employment-related services within the vocational rehabilitation program. So this is typically provided once that eligible student or a youth with a disability has further identified and explored and developed and learned about career interest. They've chosen a specific employment outcome, and this is documented on their IPE, that Individualized Plan for Employment. So it really helps them to prepare for and secure or regain any employment outcome of their choice. So VR now meets this evolving needs of students and youth with disabilities, including those with the most significant disabilities, who are transitioning from that school setting to post-secondary education or employment options. So on this continuum, we want you to understand that employment transition services, Pre-ETS, are not a standalone, separate from the VR program, but it's more of this beginning point where we have students engaging with VR and we start that exposure process so that they can then make informed choice. Next slide, Sandy. All right. As I said, Pre-ETS are that earliest set of services available for students with disabilities who are eligible or potentially eligible for the VR program. Being short-termed in nature. So I like to give the analogy that these 5 required services are like appetizers. And so our students can look at what the offerings are. They can take a bite of this, take a bite of that, determine if that's something that they want to have another bite of, or if they're like, nah, I'm good. Let me try something different. So it really, the purpose here is to help students identify career interests and explore those, so that if they wish, they can further explore them through additional VR services, such as transition services, or any other individualized vocational rehabilitation service that they need. Pre-employment transition services begin as soon as that student requests that they want them, or they are recommended by a teacher or a parent or a family member, whoever, and they want to take one or more pre-employment transition services. And it's always done arranged or provided in collaboration with the schools. And that's an important piece of all this. This is vocational rehabilitation and the schools working together. Next. All right, so these 5 required activities need to be made available by the state VR agency to any and all students with disabilities who need them. So we start with job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs at post-secondary institutions of higher education, workplace readiness training that helps to develop social skills and independent living, and also instruction in self-advocacy. And that can include peer mentoring programs or activities. So VR doesn't limit or expand these 5 required, and the state VR agencies can determine how they're going to provide pre-employment transition services. So that could be they're provided directly by a VR counselor or a Pre-ETS specialist. It can be a fee for service with other vendors or community rehabilitation programs. They may provide contracts. They may have arrangements with the school. So there's a variety of ways that they can be done. But again, the VR agency has certain responsibilities when it comes to supervision. And for those of you that did not see part 1, that is in the chat. And so afterwards, if you have questions, we can go directly to that and you can learn more. Next slide. There are 4 coordination activities that were written into the law. And these 4 coordination activities are considered essential for arranging and providing the 5 required, and there are also additional authorized activities. But for today's presentation, we're focused on just the required and the coordination. So these 4 coordination activities are that the VR agency will attend individualized education program meetings, or those IEP meetings for students with disabilities when they get invited. That's working also with the local workforce development boards, your one-stop centers, and employers to come together, develop work opportunities for students with disabilities, including internships or summer youth employment, other any kind of employment opportunities throughout the school year, to also include apprenticeships. Another coordination activity is to work with the schools, including those that carry out activities under Section 614D of the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to coordinate and ensure the provision of pre-employment transition services. So again, you see this tight collaboration and coordination with schools. And the fourth one is, when invited, that VR will attend person-centered planning meetings for individuals receiving services under Title 19 of the Social Security Act. So those are typically maybe through your DD, developmental disability agencies, for individuals who have the most significant disabilities. Next. So there's a target population that we're discussing here. This is students with disabilities. No matter what state you're in or territory, the definition of a student with a disability is an individual with a disability who's in a recognized education program. This could be high school, this could be homeschooled, this could be a private school, several, as long as it's a recognized education program where you live. And it also falls within the requirements for a minimum and maximum age that is set by the state. So every state can determine a minimum and a maximum age. And you'll see that varies between many states. This student with a disability is someone who's also eligible for and receiving special education or related services under IDEA, or is an individual with a disability for the purposes of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And they are also either eligible for or potentially eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. So that means all students with disabilities, including those who have not applied or been determined eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. So that's a new kind of game changer now for VR. We can start working with students, and they don't have to apply to the VR program. They just have to be known as a student with a disability, falling within a certain age range, enrolled in a recognized education program, and they or someone in their life says, hey, you should be taking some pre-employment transition services. Next. So I use the term potentially eligible students with disabilities. Again, these are students that the slide we just got through pertains to them. They don't have to apply for the agency, but they do have to have a disability, be in a recognized school program, and meet a certain age range. And those students can receive any or all of the 5 required pre-employment transition services: job exploration counseling, work-based learning, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in higher ed, workplace readiness training, and self-advocacy. They also would be able to receive any auxiliary aids and services that they need because they have a sensory or a communicative disability in order to access any of these 5 required pre-ed services. Next slide. So we just talked about potentially eligible. Now, eligible students with disabilities. So these are the students who have decided they want to go ahead and apply to the VR agency. They've been found eligible, and they have an individualized plan for employment that's been approved. Those students can receive, again, any of the 5 required pre-ETS. They also can receive any auxiliary aids and services that they need if they have a communicative or sensory disability. And they also can receive any additional VR services that's needed by them in order to benefit from the pre-employment transition services and it's on their approved IPE. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And now I'll give this over to Bridget.
Thanks so much, Christine. And I'm going to change the focus a little bit. So we've got this slide back up and we've already talked about this continuum of services. So I'm not going to talk through it all again. I'm just going to say that Christine kind of really gave you an overview of pre-employment transition services, the very first section on this slide. I'm going to be concentrating on transition services. And Christine gave you an overview of what that is, but I'm going to dig a little deeper into what VR transition services are. So we can move on to the next slide, Sandy. Some of the things we're going to cover on these next slides are, what are VR transition services? Who can receive them? What is required for a student or a youth? So we're introducing a new term here, the youth, to receive VR transition services. How will they receive these in terms of planning through the VR agency? So we'll look at what an individualized plan for employment looks like and how the services are added to that plan. And then we'll talk about how services are coordinated between VR and education. So that's a lot of information to come, but let's kind of just dig in a little bit here. So VR transition services are outcome-oriented services for students or youth with disabilities aged 14 to 24 who've been determined eligible for VR services. And when we say outcome-oriented services, what differentiates transition services from pre-employment transition services? So Christine kind of explained pre-employment transition services, and they're all about exposure and exploration. So when we move on to VR transition services, that requires a student or a youth to apply for VR services and then to be determined eligible for those VR services and have these services written in a plan for employment. Outcome-oriented means we're looking at these students and youth gaining some measurable skills. So we've got some measures that go along with that. We're looking at those students attaining credentials along the way, and ultimately looking at those students becoming employed in competitive integrated employment. That's what an outcome is, and that's the outcome. There are several outcomes along the way, but that's the outcome that we're really hoping to get to. So we've talked about pre-ETS and VR services, and it might almost look like, oh, well, we have to get pre-ETS first and then move on to VR transition services. But actually, there's nothing in the law that says that. They can happen side by side. So a student can receive both pre-ETS and VR transition services side by side. The difference for a youth is that a youth cannot receive pre-employment transition services, so they would only receive VR transition services. So that's that little distinction there when we use the term both youth and student. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because Christine gave you the definition of a student, and I'll give you the definition of a youth before we're done with this section. So we talked a little bit about that's right alongside the IPE. And it facilitates the movement of the receipt of those services from schools to the receipt of services from VR agencies and maybe even other state agencies. And I see that there's a lot of DD people in the audience as well. And so they will appreciate that mention of other services too that are out there in the community. I think one thing that we really want to point out on this slide is that it was never the intent of pre-employment transition services to delay the receipt of VR services. So that was never the intent. Oh, we start at pre-ETS and we get stuck there, or that's a parking lot for students. As soon as a student needs another service that's a VR service, they should be applying for those VR services in order to get into that VR system. So that's just kind of a final point on that slide there. So we can move to the next slide, Sandy. So there's a lot of information on this slide, as you can see. But really the point of this slide, and you're going to get the slide so you'll be able to read the information. So I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. But the point of this slide is really to say that the full array of individualized VR services are available to an eligible student or youth who applies for VR services. So it's any service, any VR service. And we've listed some of the services on here just so that you can see some examples of what those services might be. So they include assessment, counseling and guidance, referral for other services, job-related, training-related services, supported employment. Any of those things can be included. Really, any VR service that is provided to an eligible student or youth with a disability can be considered a transition service. So kind of thinking about that as an age range, we said 14 to 24, that's kind of that age range for transition when young people are moving along that continuum. So any VR service is available to them. All right, Sandy, thank you. So I promised you a definition of a youth with a disability. So we said students have to be engaged in a school program and a recognized school program in order to meet that definition of a student with a disability. A youth with a disability, on the other hand, means any individual with a disability who's not younger than 14 years of age. So they did put a lower age limit on that, 14 years of age, and not older than 24 years of age. There's no requirement that a youth must be enrolled in an educational program. An eligible student and or a youth with a disability can receive transition services, but only students can receive pre-ETS. And I've said that a couple of times, and Christine said it several times, but it really is an important distinction because people, that can be a point of confusion. That's why we're repeating that a little bit. All students really can be considered youth, but not all youth are students. So that's just kind of another way of looking at that. And the VR counselor may develop an individualized plan for employment. We call it an IPE, with either a projected post-school employment outcome for an eligible individual who's a student or youth. And the reason, and we'll go into Sandy's going to talk a lot more about that projected post-school employment outcome. But we know that in that age range from 14 to 24, it's really hard to say, I'm going to be a doctor and that's what I'm going to be and that's it. You know, people haven't made up their minds. They're still exploring. And even though they might be receiving VR transition services, they might still be exploring. So that allows for some latitude with that employment goal. And like I said, Sandy will talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, Sandy. So I'm going to stop there. We've thrown a lot of information at you already. And just to see if there are any questions, either that my colleagues see coming up in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask a question right now about that information before we move on, I'll just for a minute.
Bridget, Bernadette had a great question that she put in the chat, which is the IPE created by a VR representative, school personnel, or collaborative effort that occurs as a part of the IEP process?
That's a terrific question, Bernadette, and I will start to answer, but I'll let any of my colleagues kind of jump in if I miss anything. But the IPE is created in collaboration with VR. So yes, you will have a VR counselor who's helping guide that process, generally speaking. But really the primary person for the direction of that IPE is the student or youth who's developing the plan, because really it's their plan, right? So it should be a student or youth-centered plan. In fact, a person can come to VR and say, I've written my plan, take a look at it, and they can have some discussion about what's in that plan, but it doesn't have to actually be written by a VR counselor. However, the VR counselor would have to agree with that plan and start putting those things in motion for it to be an approved plan, let's say. So it is approved by VR, but it really should be very much a student or youth-centered developed document. I would say that the law guides us, and I think it's Alison who'll go into this a little bit later, but the law really guides us to develop that plan for employment in alignment with the IEP that's written in school. So when we're writing an IEP or when we're writing a plan for employment, we really want to look at that IEP that's developed in the school so that those plans align and everybody's working together towards, you know, a common goal, be that a common broad goal or a common narrow goal, that we should be working in alignment with each other so that the services really help to complement each other to get that student or if it's an IEP, it's a student, but to get that student to the point where they want to go.
Yeah, and just to add to what Bridget said, Bernadette, you won't be doing the IPE during the IEP process, but as she said, we want to take that IEP and help use that to develop the IPE. So the processes will be a little bit separate of how those are done, but really that IEP should be informing what the IPE looks like. So I hope that helps. Oh, Christine, please.
I was just going to point out that also speaks to those 4 coordination activities that I mentioned, because the one coordination activity is for the VR professional to attend that IEP when invited by the school. So that right there is that collaboration and coordination with education. That's so critical because we're both supporting the same student.
Thanks, Christine. And then another question that came in around funding. And is this more federally funded or is it state funded? And I will say that VR is a combination of both federal and state funding to support the program. And so, yes, we do get some funding from the federal government, but then we also get funding from state government as well.
And Alison, just to add to that, the majority of the funding is federal funding. So it's like a almost 4-to-1 match with state funding. So the majority for VR programs in the states, they are run at a state level, but the majority of the funding is federal. And I would say if you have any concerns about funding or you're worried about that, reach out to your representatives and let them know that you're worried about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that's all I see, unless I'll give it 1 second in case anybody wants to unmute, but otherwise we'll move on. Yep, and I'm not seeing anything, and we will have a chance at the end again to ask more questions. So if anything else comes up, and keep putting the questions in the chat. So we've talked about pre-employment transition services and VR transition services. So we're talking a little bit about what's the process and how does this work really, and what's the process for VR? Because a lot of people think, just tell me, give me the whole picture so I can see. So Sandy put this slide together for us, and I really like this slide. And although we have said you do not have to be potentially eligible first in order to apply for VR services, those things can happen simultaneously. Very often, a student is first introduced to VR through that door of being a potentially eligible student. That's just the way it happens sometimes, but both can be simultaneous. So we've got potentially eligible student, and when that student needs or wants, in accordance with informed choice, so all the way along, vocational rehabilitation should be giving you informed choice about the whole array of services that are available. What's available to you as a potentially eligible student, what's available to you as an eligible person who applies for VR, all that kind of menu of services, if you want to say. We should be telling you about that regularly so that you can make informed decisions. So once you need or you want to apply for VR services, you can go ahead and apply for those VR services. Then there is an eligibility decision that has to be made at that point. And a person is determined eligible and are assigned a disability priority. So every VR agency has a set of priorities, from those with the most significant disabilities to maybe less significant disabilities. And it says here, and order of selection, and we don't go into order of selection deeply in this webinar, and I've kind of had a look, and I know some of the states in the area do fall in an order of selection, but when a person is on an order of selection, they're on a waiting list to get those services. So they'll be taken off the waiting list depending on when they applied for services. So once we have eligibility determined, the next, along with that, we're doing a comprehensive assessment of rehabilitation needs. So kind of looking at what are the needs of that person in order to write that individualized plan for employment that we've been talking about already. So we look at that comprehensive assessment of rehabilitation needs is a combination of the expertise from VR, the information that we might have pulled from the school and the IEP and in talking with school personnel, but primarily from the person themselves that we're talking to help write that plan. Then it goes on to providing services. And those services could include a vast array, like I mentioned already, but it often includes some training and things like that along the way, supported employment, with the goal of getting to employment, and that would be competitive integrated employment, whether that's supported employment or not, but it is considered competitive integrated, paid at minimum wage or above and with enough hours to support the person, all of those kind of things. And then we go to closure. We exit with a successful employment outcome. And that has to be at least 90 days after that placement, but it could be longer than that 90 days, as long as that person needs that follow-up. And then there are also some post-exit services that are available to people as well.
Bridget, do you mind if I just make a quick comment here? I almost feel like one of the things we could have and maybe should have done with this slide was have arrows pointing to the left and to the right in between the comprehensive assessment of rehab needs, the individualized plan for employment, and the service provision, because the way this slide is laid out kind of implies that this is a very linear process and you go from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. And ideally, yes, but there is definitely room for some flexibility here. So it might be that you do an assessment, you make a plan for employment, and you start to provide services, but maybe some things are uncovered as that student or youth is going through some of those services, and you need to amend the plan. And I will talk about that a little bit more, but you might even have to go back to doing some additional assessments. And so it does not mean that once that plan is in place, that it is the plan, that's the only plan, and that's the final plan that the individual will have. In fact, we really hope that that is not at all. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I just wanted to make that comment to make it clear that it doesn't mean you can't go back and revisit some of these steps, because you absolutely can.
I love that, Sandy, because I think everything with VR, it's not linear, and that's kind of what we've been trying to point out. Like, it's not pre-ETS first and what this next and this next. It can be fluid, and it should always be holistic and looking at what are all of the needs of the person. And just because a need crops up later doesn't mean we shouldn't take it into account. I mean, that's even the case in terms of the eligibility and disability. Okay, you've been made eligible, but what if a new disability pops up? That happens more than we would think, actually, that a person might acquire an injury during the process, or because sometimes a VR plan can go on for many years, and so things don't stay static in terms of our disability even. So, once determined to have a disability, yes, you're in the program, but you might also have to take into account some, future limitations and things like that change things. So yeah, no, I love that, Sandy. Thanks so much. And we can move on to the next slide. So what's the timeline then? So once we determine eligibility, and we've got 60 days in the VR program to determine that eligibility, but we really want to determine eligibility as soon as possible. Once eligibility is determined, you really want to write that plan for employment as soon as possible as well. There's no need to delay. The law gives us 90 days to write that plan, but we don't want to be hanging around for 90 days if we know what that plan is going to be. And particularly, I would say in the case of a student or a youth, because we're allowed to write a plan with a potential goal, we don't have to have, we can have a projected goal, should I say, rather than a potential goal, but a projected post-school employment outcome. It does not have to be down to the level of detail that we know every single thing about that person's employment goal. We should be able to get that plan written. And we certainly should also write it if we've got an eligible student with a disability. We want to write that plan before the student leaves the school setting. Can it be extended? Yes. But the agency and the individual have to agree to the extension. And you also have to have a specific date that will say the plan will be written by this specific date. So yes, you can extend, but there are limits around that. All right, and what goes on an IEP? So we've talked about that vocational goal. We also want to talk about on the IEP, we need to put the specific services that are going to be required to achieve the outcome. That could be including training, assistive technology, supported employment, whatever that person needs in order to achieve their goal. You also have some timelines for achieving the outcome and for those services along the way. You need to include the entities that will provide the service and how they will be purchased. So various VR agencies do that in different ways. Some provide a lot of direct services to their clients, but some also purchase those services through vendors. So that's why you've got to lay out those costs and how that will happen. Criteria to evaluate the progress towards the achievement of objectives. So, how will that VR person check in with you and evaluate how well your plan is going? What recourse do you have to come back to VR and say, oops, this happened. Now we need to amend or change things in order to fix it a little bit along the way. It also outlines the roles and responsibilities of both VR and the individual and those terms and conditions of service. The individual's cost for participation, if applicable, again, that varies from state to state as well a little bit, and any comparable benefits that are out there that we can draw upon to really support that person's plan. So it's a lot that goes in there. It's pretty much writing a contract to help this person achieve their goal. So there's lots of specifics that go in there. And I'm going to hand it over to Sandy, and she is going to talk more about that IPE.
Thanks, Bridget. So you heard from Bridget the required elements of a plan. So as you can imagine, that employment goal is pretty important for an organization, for an agency whose mission is to help individuals with disabilities achieve employment. That employment goal is a really big deal. It's a very important part of the planning process. And so we need to make sure that what is on that individualized plan for employment is actually aligning with or matching the job that person achieves. However, Bridget also alluded to the fact that there's the ability for VR to use a projected post-school employment outcome. And this is really important. As VR starts working with younger students and youth, all the way down to 14, we know that they may not know what they want to do. We don't even really know how much they've been exposed to. So that's the whole idea behind this projected post-school employment outcome, is it's a really great opportunity for VR to identify some ways that a student can have maybe a broader goal and start thinking about, how do I explore this particular goal, and then think about what's necessary to refine that goal so I can get to a specific employment outcome. But I need to be able to explore my options and really see what's out there. So what is an individualized plan for employment? That's exploratory in nature. Really what we're looking at here is generally that's going to be that very first plan or that initial plan that's being made with the eligible students with disabilities. So it's starting off, and they may or may not have received any services. If they have received some pre-employment transition services as a potentially eligible student, you might have some ideas as to what they've already received. They might have some ideas as to some sort of general career plans, but the projected post-school employment outcome and an exploratory plan really allows for some of that additional learning for that student to take place about not just their career interests, but about themselves. So it allows them to explore career options and develop some of those foundational interpersonal skills and skills that we know everyone needs for employment. And then the projected post-school employment outcome is just going to basically be used to identify what are all the services that are going to be needed in order to help that student explore and then refine that goal to a more specific goal. And so bringing us back to that whole continuum of VR services that we've talked about, Christine started off our presentation showing that diagram with the arrows going down, talking first about pre-ETS and then transition and then employment. And Bridget sort of brought us back to that again. And we really want everyone to recognize that this is a continuum of VR services, that all of these things should be used together to provide the most comprehensive set of services for students as they're progressing through their transition. So a confirmed and agreed upon career of interest where VR transition services and possibly pre-ETS are needed to further pursue and prepare for that career. That's where we're refining this. So if a student knows what they want to do, or they're pretty sure they know what they want to do, then maybe they're ready to go on to that specific employment goal. We would see that as they're progressing through or moving along this continuum, that plan is going to look a little different. So we're going to need to be making some amendments. We might start out with an exploratory plan, and they might start to refine their goal, and then we start to see more transition services, VR transition services identified on that plan. Students with disabilities, like we've talked about already, they are still eligible to receive pre-employment transition services if they're needed. So they can be getting those pre-ETS services at the same time that they're getting those VR transition services. We just want to make sure that once they're eligible and they have an individualized plan for employment in place, that all of those services that they're receiving, both pre-employment and VR transition, are included on that plan. So we also, in addition to looking at whether or not it's going to be a projected post-school employment outcome or it's going to be that specific employment outcome, we want to identify who's going to provide each service. So is VR going to be providing them? Christine talked about this a little bit with regard to pre-ETS. There are several different ways that these services can be provided. There could be services available through a school. They could be through the VR program directly, or they might be available by a Center for Independent Living in your community, and they might be free. So we want to think about who's going to provide the service, who's paying the service, and then again, looking at how do we know the student received what we hoped they would. How are we measuring their progress? How do we know that they're actually making progress towards that employment goal? So those are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. And the other thing I want to just make sure we're thinking about here is when you're thinking about that projected post-school employment outcome and whether or not that's more appropriate or a specific employment goal, we want to be thinking about how and what services are needed for a student who might have an idea about what they want to do. Maybe they are thinking, I want to be in the medical field, or perhaps maybe they think I want to be a nurse, but I don't really know what's all involved in that. So we can help them through that projected post-school employment outcome and outlining the services on the plan and where they're going to get them, who's going to pay for them, and the progress that they're making towards them. We can start to help them refine that goal. So perhaps maybe they start with a broad goal of being in the medical field, or maybe even specifying they want to be a nurse, but they get some experience looking at some of those more entry-level positions, maybe a personal care assistant or a certified nursing assistant. They have some opportunities to do some informational interviews or maybe shadow some folks doing those jobs, maybe they get a work-based learning experience. All of that information should be outlined in the plan. And through that exploration, that student is able to say, you know, hopefully what we're hoping they get is whether or not it is validating that, yes, this sort of nursing field is what I want to be doing. Or maybe they're like, you know what, I don't really like all of the blood and the different kinds of skills that it takes. I don't really want to have to do all of that stuff with people that's so heavy on the medical side, but I really love working with patients. Maybe that helps them refine their goal to being a patient representative, where they like more of that case management side of things, where they're happy to help make sure patients are connected to services, or understanding what a patient might be eligible to receive and helping them to make some informed decisions around their medical care. So using this projected post-school employment outcome and identifying the services on the plan is the way to help them refine that goal to that specific goal. And again, we want to make sure that we're looking at that from the lens of, if they're a student still in school, we want them to have these experiences so that we can update that plan, make an amendment, and have a concrete employment goal in place before they leave school. But we don't have to. If there's more that needs to take place, if there's more exploration that needs to take place, like I talked about on the slide that talked about the process, it's really important to take our time and to really help identify the services and supports that a student's going to need. And so along with that, one of the things that we often see is it can be a lot easier to identify the kinds of services that are needed that are very specific to maybe training or employment supports or education that a student needs to achieve that employment goal. But sometimes we forget about those support services that might be really specific to their disability that are necessary. So we might have a plan that identifies, they're going to go on to, they're going to start as a certified nursing assistant, and they're going to get their certification, and they're going to do it here, and it's going to get paid by VR, and have all that laid out. But what happens if they get into that program and all of a sudden they realize, oh, maybe they don't have their screen magnification software that's necessary for them to participate in their classes, or maybe they need some additional supports on the job if they're in a work-based learning experience. So what we want to really do, what's important to do, is start with that disability and look at what are the steps or services needed to be addressed that are very disability related. We want to be addressing their assistive technology needs up front if they need them. We want to make sure that we're doing the right kinds of assessments so that we can identify all those needs prior to them getting into an experience where they don't have the proper support. They might be absolutely fine to pass all their classes and everything, but if they can't access the classwork, we've got a problem. So we also want to look at any disability-related services that might be a one-time thing, or maybe they're going to be ongoing. So for example, if someone needs, maybe they need that screen reading software or screen magnification, that might be something that we purchase once during the process, and then they don't need that again, but they're going to use it because it's something that is going to, be useful to them for several years. Whereas maybe what we also need to be considering is whether or not they need a job coach. Maybe maybe having someone on the job with them, teaching them the job for a week is enough, but maybe it's something that they're going to need for several months as they're learning their job. So we need to be thinking about those long-term and short-term resources and supports that they need as well. And then where are those resources coming from? Does the individual have some access to resources? Are they working with any other organizations in the community that can provide them? Or is that going to be something that VR is going to support? So it's just really important to really think more holistically, like Bridget said. We really need to be thinking holistically, but we want to start with that disability and make sure that we know that we're properly supporting an individual in their process, because we don't want that, by not having the right supports in place, we don't want that to be the reason that they're not successful with moving through this continuum of VR services. So as I talked about with regard to the example of sort of moving them through that exploratory plan into a more concrete kind of specific employment goal, here are some of the questions that we definitely want to make sure that we're considering, and that really helps us identify what services need to go on the plan. So we need to be thinking about and talking with that student or youth about the minimum standards for that employment goal so that they can understand what is going to be required. If they want to be a registered nurse, they're likely to need at least a bachelor's degree, maybe some other certifications. But if they want to be a CNA or a patient representative, they might be able to get an associate's degree, or perhaps it's on the job training that they get based on the experience and other training that they've received. And so we want to make sure that they are going into this and identifying an employment goal that really aligns with not just what they want to do, but what they're willing to do in order to achieve that. So what are the minimum standards for the employment goal? What training might be required? Where is it offered? Is it something that they're interested in doing? If it's, if it's a full-time training program, and they have no desire to go to school after high school, they're like, I'm done. I don't want to go, 8 hours a day again. Then, we need to take a look at that. Maybe there's a certification program or something more short-term. And then we also want to make sure that they're properly supported in any of the training that they're going to be taking. We also need to consider, and this is super important as we're identifying not just that projected post-school employment outcome, but as we refine that and move into that specific employment goal, we need to look at the local labor market information. Does that support the occupational goal that that individual is interested in? Is it in their community where they live? Or might they have to relocate? Moving to another town, not very far from them might not be such a big deal, but having to move maybe to another state might be a much bigger consideration for them. So it's really important that we're not only looking at, what it takes to actually achieve an employment goal, but then also, where is that job? Is it in their community, or is it someplace that they're willing to move to? And then really always kind of coming back to, are there any additional services that we haven't accounted for? Making sure that that person has the proper support, so we're making good decisions around whether or not this is going to be a good goal for them. And not that we think we know if it's a good goal for them, but for them to make an educated decision and informed choice about whether or not that's the goal that they really want to settle on. So before I turn it over to Allison, we've talked again about how important it is, and it was a great question that was in the chat about the coordination with education and how does that look. And like Bridget said, we really are in the VR law. We are basically told we need to write our individualized plan for employment in consideration of that student's individualized education program or any 504 services that they might be receiving or eligible to receive. So it really calls it out there that we need to be taking those documents into consideration. And it makes a lot of sense that if we're asking, oftentimes what we hear is we should get that IEP from the schools. We need to know what that's on. We need to make sure that goals are the same and that services are aligned. And we also, I think, from the VR side, need to consider how we might be able to share information back to education. Because one of the things that we see is, we might have access to so much more information now that students have the ability to go into pre-employment transition services. And we're learning so much more information. VR has so much more information at their fingertips than they ever had before WIOA was put into law. And so we want to make sure that we're also sharing that back to the family, to the student, to the school, so that as they're developing their IEPs, they also have a lot of information available to them and not having to duplicate the work that's being done. Again, just want to reiterate that it's important. VR really needs to make sure that those individualized plan for employment are in place before a student leaves the high school setting. We know how much harder it is to engage a student if they exit without a plan in place for them, a really solid plan in place for them. So it's really important that we do that before they leave the school setting. And now I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, so as Sandy said, coordination with education and VR the timing is everything, because you do want to make sure that we've got that plan in place before the students leave school, but then that they are really also considering all that's in the IEP and or 504 services if that's applicable to the student. So I love this slide because really, prior to WIOA, we really kind of saw education handing off a student from that education side to that adult side. And it was like, okay, here you go. But now, because of WIOA and a lot of what Christine first kind of started talking about, is that idea of utilizing those pre-employment transition services in order to determine what that student needs. Is it's not really a handoff. It's that joint sharing of making sure that we get the student from one type of services to that other type of service together. So we really want these services to overlap when students begin working with Voc Rehab and then moving on. So again, transition services are not about the handoff, but a common outcome or shared vision among all partners, which is a key component to success for students with disabilities. And so really understanding and knowing they've still got education there as they're starting to move into the Voc Rehab world. So collaboration with schools. So the regulations redefine the meaning of collaboration between VR and education. More than ever, effective communication and building strong relationships are key to that development. And not just for Pre-ETS, but like Sandy just talked about, but for all transition services and that development of that individual plan for employment. What does that look like for students? How can we make sure that we're utilizing all of the great information from the education side and building that into that plan? So local education agencies are obligated to provide transition services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that is something that they must do, that as free, appropriate public education. As well as Title I of the Voc Rehab Act is looking at reducing the local education agency's obligation to provide the services that can be made available through VR. So we really want to sit there and work with education to say, here, we want you to provide this, but then the VR side is going to provide that. And here's going to be the process of how you can continue to get those services, first with Pre-ETS and then moving into youth transition services, as well as full adult VR services. So let's just kind of compare that individual education plan and that individual plan for employment. So here's just some good examples of what these may look like. So under the IEP, the school may provide a student with attending a career tech education class in auto repair. So that's something that on the education side that they can do. While as on the VR side, under the IPE, they can do Pre-ETS activities, which could include labor market research, looking into auto jobs. What does that look like? I mean, Sandy talked a lot about, is that job available in this community? Would I have to move for this? They can really spend that time looking at that, as well as letting the student actually do a paid work experience to say, do I even like this? Do I like getting my hands dirty? Is this something that I'm interested in? So those are two ways they can really support one another. Some other ways under the IEP, they can look at a goal for increasing competencies in reading and writing. While at the same time on the VR side, they can have students work on workplace readiness training or soft skills through their program. Another one, during their senior year, during the IEP, the school could provide assistance in setting up a PowerPoint on how to lead their own IEP. They're really looking at advocating for themselves, talking through themselves, knowing what their disability is and being able to talk through that. While on the VR side, students can be participating in a self-advocacy program through their local centers for independent living, and they can work on the ability to really articulate what those accommodations are. So again, working on that through the IEP, as well as working on that through the independent living center. And then finally, a student on an IEP, they might have a post-school goal to attend community college for automotive body repair. Through that, they may tour a community college or look at what that college may be. Whereas under Pre-ETS, the student can be able to get counseling on enrollment and what that may look like. They may get assistance with completing financial aid information or other ways to help look at those programs and what are available. So you can really see how these really complement one each other. We're looking at two different services in different ways, but they're all complementary to what we're looking at moving forward. And that's really why we want those two dogs holding that stick at the same time, so we can really help to move those services forward together. We do have a resource that's available for you all on the NTACT-The Collaborative website. It is linked here on the bottom. It's called the Side-by-Side of Transition Services. But what this does is this provides you with more information to really look at what is that definition of pre-employment transition services. What are those supposed to look like? And I know Christine did a great job of kind of covering this and looking at that, but you know that they are short term, that what it is that they look like. And then moving into the VR transition services, which both Bridget and Sandy both talked about, is what are the differences and how do those services look as those students are moving forward? And last but not least, what are students currently receiving under the Individuals with Disabilities Act and IDEA services? And how can we, again, look at those moving together and moving forward? So please view this slide by side. It really helps to provide a little bit more information and resources available to you to see that the difference between these services and how they really are meant to complement each other.
And I just want to make a quick comment that this is just a screenshot of the very first page. This document outlines really the alignment all the way through. So there's a lot more information that's available if you go to the website or follow this link. But this is just a screenshot about the definitions.
Thank you, Sandy. Yes. And with that, I will turn this back over to Christine.
Thanks, Allison. All right. We're almost to the end here, so let's soldier on here and we'll be able to answer questions from those of you that have them. Let's look at what the role of the Parent and Training Information Centers are. So the or as the acronym is, the PTI, they really are your source of knowledge about the VR process and services that students and youth get, and those services could be pre-employment transition services or the VR transition services, anything that's needed to support students and youth and their families. So they are there to help encourage your engagement with VR. They can help you look at how to get invited, how to make sure that VR is invited to that IEP meeting at the school. So they can serve in that advocacy role. They also are able to understand the bigger picture of transition. And so that's moving from that entitlement to that free and public appropriate education, right? To the kind of adult world of services where it's an eligibility. You have to be eligible for Medicaid, or you have to be eligible for DD services, or you're eligible for vocational rehabilitation. And they can also help you to actively develop and sustain that relationship with your state and local VR administrators and counselors so that, you know, there's a goal that they can help be that advocate and an ally for the students and youth and families and the VR program in order to make sure that there's the best service delivery that you can get and that it runs smoothly. And they can also actively participate as part of the State Rehabilitation Council, which is the SRC. That's a requirement of every state VR agency. So they are very active in making sure that you as parents or professionals, family members, that you get the information that you need. Next slide. Now, the next two slides are a number of resources that are available on the NTACT-C website about pre-employment transition services. all of these you will receive after this webinar with the recording. And when you get these slides, these are live links. So again, anytime you see that line underneath, it's a live link. You can just click on that and go to that section. But we offer a compendium on how pre-employment transition services can be delivered. There's separate ones on each of the 5 required. So again, this is a great starting point for you if you have questions or you say, I don't remember what the counselor told me when I was with my family member at that meeting. Let me see what we have here. Next slide. Again, there's the NTACT-C website. That side-by-side view of transition services that Allison just got through talking about. And even another great resource is the Transition Guide to Post-Secondary Education and Employment for Students and Youth with Disabilities. I highly recommend that. It's put out by the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitation Services. It's really written in plain language. So I think you'll find it very helpful. And I would say keep that as your kind of go-to thing to look at. So now let's go ahead, open up the floor for questions.
Christine, there have been lots of questions coming in chat, and I've tried to answer some of those questions as we were going through. Some are not short answers. So people might have follow-up questions. Certainly, there are a lot of questions around accessing services, if services don't seem to be available in the community, that sort of thing. So I would say, you know, reach out to your VR agency, ask questions, be an advocate for yourself, your child, the person you're working on behalf of. I would say always reach out. I think it was great that Christine also pointed out in the chat earlier that every agency has a client assistance program. And if you're not receiving services or you've questions about the services that you're receiving or just, I mean, not just dissatisfied in any way, but if you've got questions and you're not seeming to get the answers, remember that that's what the client assistance program is there for. And that is accessible to everyone, whether it's a student in receipt of pre-employment transition services as potentially eligible or as eligible. CAP is there for you. So I would reach out to my CAP program if, and that's not a negative thing. I mean, often a VR agency might seem to consider that a negative thing, but you know, I grew up, did all my work in a VR agency growing up, and we were always taught that it was always an opportunity to engage further with the client. So I think don't be afraid to use CAP or don't see it as something negative.
And our contact information will be included in the slides. And so it is possible for you guys to reach out to us following this presentation. You will find that contact information for each of us in this presentation that Dawn will be sending out.
Yeah, I actually took the slide down, but why don't I go ahead and share my screen again so that people have our contact information, because we had a few questions about that, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're doing the Q&A, please be sure to take the poll that is on the screen. You should see it.
There was
Yeah.
one question about, you know, Carla asked, her son has just started pre-ETS services, and could he have an IPE with some kind of plan to work? And yes, Carla, alongside, I mean, it depends. So your student, if you're saying he just started pre-ETS services, it may be as a potentially eligible student. But if you're interested in exploring, okay, what other services are available to me through VR, I would sit down and talk with the counselor about, you know, we really are interested in employment. We want to apply. Tell me more about services. Tell me about that application process and how we go about that so that your son can have an IPE. So just, it is always there as something to explore.
Absolutely.
And we recognize that this is a lot of information and that it will take you several times of hearing it before some of it actually clicks. I mean, we did this presentation with NTACT 3 years ago and we decided to do it again because we knew that. So, but I do recommend that you go to their website. You do have to register on their website in order to access it, which is not a big deal. And there's so much information on the NTACT-C website. So, I recommend that you would do that as well.
And
Actually, Dawn, we actually can, we took that off. So now you don't have to sign up.
Oh,
If you
good. When
want-
did that happen?
Oh, several months back. Actually,
Okay.
if you want to watch a webinar, then it does require you to sign up with an email. But just to access the website and look at resources other than a webinar, you're good to go.
And please, if you have questions, reach out to one of us because there is so much information on the website that it can be hard to locate. One, if you don't know what you're looking for, it can be hard to find it because you don't know exactly what category it might be under. But it can also, it's hard to know what you don't know. So please don't spend a lot of time. Feel free to reach out to us and we can either direct you or send you the information you're looking for or try to find it if for some reason it's not on our website.
And I would say since we have a lot of different people here from all different states and all over the country, reach out to your Parent Training and Information Center. There's one in every state. If you don't know who that is, you can go to parentcenterhub.org. I'll put it in the chat and find out your parent center and reach out to them because they will have information for you on your own state's VR agency. So I know here in New Jersey, our VR agency does collaborate with our New Jersey Department of Ed, and they do presentations on Pre-ETS and how to access them. So find out what your own VR agency is doing to help you in that state figure out how to access and what types of services are available with regard to Pre-ETS and voc rehab.
Dawn, I love that you said that about reaching out to PTI because I think a lot of the questions that are coming in could be supported by PTI because it seems like it's access to services. How can we reach those services? What services are included? What are we, I don't mean entitled to, but what should we be looking for from our VR agencies?
Right.
I would also say that every VR agency in every state has a website, and I would, look through that. Some are more comprehensive than others, but I would look for that website just to see, okay, what's available? What are they saying about their services? What are they telling us is available? And I think, yes, learning what might be available so that you can ask and advocate for yourself is
Right.
helpful.
And many parent training and information centers collaborate with their state partners. So they will have information and, it's in it. All the parent training and information centers have a representative that sits on the rehab council, which is the state rehab council, SRC, which is VR's board, I guess, if, for lack of a better word. So there are partners, so you should reach out to them and they can find you resources or assist you to go further in the process. I don't see any other questions. So I want to thank all of our partners at the National Technical Assistance Center, the Collaborative. As usual, I appreciate all the effort that you put into these presentations, and I'm sure everybody here appreciates it as well. I'm going to end the poll because I think no one is really doing it any longer. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our presenters, and I hope you found this helpful. I will send out the recording along with a copy of the presentation within a couple days, and we've given you a lot of information and you know where to go if you need more information on this topic. So Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. We'll be in touch, and I'll see you in May.
Sounds very good. Thanks so much,
Wonderful.
Dawn.
Great.
Thanks.
Hi.
You.